Welcome back to the 17th floor. My name is Sam Fiorella, and I will be your moderator and host once again for today's Ask the Expert discussion. Today, I am really excited to have Kevin Eikenberry join us, who is an expert in remote work environments. In fact, he's written 3 books on the subject of remote work from different perspectives: management, teamwork, and employees, that I think is just so appropriate and so timely for what we're going to be talking about today, which is managers, and how do managers need to behave and think differently in the new world of work, be it completely remote or in a hybrid work environment. So once again, I'd like to welcome Kevin Eikenberry from the Kevin Eikenberry Group, author and business consultant on all things related to our most valuable assets, our people. Thanks for joining us today, Kevin.
It's my pleasure to be here, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Why don't you give us a little rundown of the three latest books that you have put out, both ahead of the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic, and now post-pandemic?
Sure. Well, first of all, isn't it nice to say post-pandemic? In 2018, we wrote a book called The Long Distance Leader, Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. And that came out, as you said, pre-pandemic. And it really is getting at how to help leaders who are leading teams that at that time, maybe they were all remote or they were partly remote, which is really where many of us are now, sort of in that hybrid or flexible work scenario. So that book is about that. And it's about what we've learned with clients and what I do every single day. And then about the time the pandemic got going, meaning people got sent home, we were finishing the manuscript for the next book, which is called The Long Distance Teammate, which is the role of individual team members of being successful when they're not always with their leader and their teammates. And then just recently, we released the newest book, which is called The Long Distance Team, Designing Your Team for Everyone's Success. So it's a world that's different, in the world of work is different. And so whether we're at a distance or not, how do we design our teams for this new world? And how do we intentionally create culture that will help us be successful, both as a business and as individuals that work in that business?
Yeah, and as an aside, if I didn't know better, I might say that you caused all of this just to make the release of those books so timely. Did you visit? Did you travel a lot at the start of the pandemic?
None of that at all whatsoever. In 2018, if we go back there when The Long Distance Leader came out, I mean, there was already movement in the direction of more people working from home, at least some of the time, more people having jobs and then moving and keeping their jobs, which is certainly the case with my team. My team is spread out across the U.S. We've got people in 9 different states, including someone who lives in her RV. So as of this moment, it's 9 states. Another day, she might be in a state that one of her teammates. But that was something that was already happening, Sam, right? We were already moving slowly in the direction of more flexible work, more hybrid work, more people working remotely. But then the pandemic came, and the genie's out of the bottle, right?
Yeah, sped it up. I think I've had this conversation internally with a lot of leaders, and it says that, the pandemic really didn't create the hybrid work model. Technology started that, and it enabled us to be able to work remotely a lot more efficiently. And that's, all the pandemic did really was speed it up, or just force it onto everybody, as opposed to allowing it to slowly gradually build.
Yeah, I think that's right. It certainly sped it up, but it did speed up technology too, because it forced a lot of organizations, technology providers, to figure out ways to make it better, right? Even then, although to your point, I mean, Microsoft Teams existed before. We had Slack and we had Zoom, although now Zoom is a verb, right? But the reality is the technology enables it. Like if think about the impact on our economies. If the pandemic happened as it happened in 1970, instead of 2020, right? It would have been an entirely different thing, because the technology did enable us to make it work. Like in 1970, we didn't even have a fax machine, right? We had phones, right?
Yeah.
So it changed everything, but the technology enabled us to be more successful.
We've had a lot of conversations on the 17th floor about hybrid work environments and remote work and the future of work, and because that's all anybody's talking about, and it happens to be one of our biggest challenges today. But a lot of those conversations have been around creating an office environment and creating, educating employees on the benefits of it and how to manage employees. We're not talking enough about the management. And I think that you can set up all the technology you want to connect people from a distance. But if you don't have the right management practices, nor train the managers to manage a team remotely, all of that means absolutely nothing. So your first book was that. So I'd like to maybe start off with a perspective from you. Have you identified or noticed a skills gap from what you envisioned with the long distance leader, in your pre-pandemic book to today, in effectively managing remote work teams?
Well, I think the single biggest idea in that first book was, the subtitle of the book is Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. And rule number 1 is think leadership first and location second. And so the message we were trying to get across is leading a team at a distance is different, but it's not 100% different. Like, don't forget what you already know about leading effectively, right? So what I would say is that leaders that were already pretty effective, pretty self-aware, pretty able to build trust and build their team and coach their team, like they were able to move forward and figure it out. But the leaders who were already weaker were more exposed, right? And I was sort of chuckling if people are watching there. I was chuckling as you were talking about technologies, because one of the technologies that some leaders decided to implement was things like, watching for keystrokes and what are people doing, like, which is part of the problem, right? People said one of the biggest things that happened, Sam, when we went into the pandemic and we sent everybody home, was leaders would say to us, like, how do I know if they're working? I said, you didn't know if they were working when they're in the office. I said, what do you mean? I said, unless you were looking over their shoulder, all you knew was they were at their desk. And so the reality is, so many leaders were forced to think about the fact that we shouldn't be and really can't be leading based on activity, but need to be leading based on accomplishment. It doesn't really matter if they check their washing machine, right? It matters is, did the report get done effectively, on time, correctly? It only matters, unless I'm a person who is customer facing and needs to be answering the phone, one after the other until my break. The rest of it should all be, and that is their accomplishment, right? That is the output. But for many others, the outputs are different. And that's what leaders need to be focused on, is what are the outputs that people need to reach. And when leaders think that way, they're much less likely to do some of the things that a lot of teammates have been frustrated by, like feeling hovered over, helicoptered, micromanaged, etc.
There's no question that there's a lot of employees who are pushing back on the idea of returning to the office, are using I don't know if it's an excuse or the belief, perceived or real, that you don't trust me to do my work from home. When in reality, that actually, not in reality, 50% of the times, or maybe more, that's probably the case, because we have a lot of old school managers that are used to micromanaging, are used to being able to walk around the office and dictating and watching and managing that way. But there's another group, I like to consider myself in that group, that is really more performance based. And I don't care what time you start, what time you end, as long as, here's a quarterly objective, get your quarterly objective done. And as long as that's done, I don't care how you do it or where you do it. But there is something, though, to be said about the hybrid work environment and coming in for the creativity, the spontaneity that happens in those types of environment. So understanding what's right for your work, and then translating that. There's a communication issue. There's an education issue that managers have to be able to do.
Yeah, there's a huge one. And I've had that chance to help organizations craft some of that communication, or to give feedback after that communication has happened. And I think you stated it right. Like, the right answer for where people ought to be working and how people ought to be working should be based on the work, right? And some people think, Sam, well, Kevin, you wrote 3 books that have the word long distance in it, so you must be kind of a zealot for remote work. I am not. I'm a zealot for highly effective work. And so that means that I believe that in many cases it can be done at a distance, but it doesn't mean it needs to be or has to be, or in every case even should be. And so the first thing I would say to any organization, any leaders that are trying to communicate the fact that, hey, we want to go hybrid, or we want to standardize what we've been trying to move toward, and it's going to be people in the office some or all of the time, then the first thing that you've got to do is be really clear about the business reasons why. Really clear about the business reasons why. And too often it comes down to a lot of discussion about why you're going to almost remember that you liked the office and it'll really be okay, as opposed to here. Now, nothing wrong with that conversation, but that all needs to come after the conversation about what are the business reasons why. Listen, I'm proud of how this organization did during the pandemic, and we had to shift. We did a lot of things. And the reality is that we're slipping on some of our KPIs. And we believe that if people were in the office 2 days a week on average, and we figure out how to do work effectively in both scenarios, that we can come closer to reaching our KPIs. We can come closer to reaching our revenue goals. Like, let's talk about the business need and why the change to that will make a difference. And if you do that, in a credible way, for the most part, people that are engaged and care about your organization are going to say, okay, might not be my first choice, right? Like most of the surveys that said about where people want to work, they asked like, where do you want to work? Well, a lot of people are going to say, sure, 80% of people are going to say, I'd rather be home most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, what's the best way for us to be successful as an organization? More people will say, well, it's probably some of each. Like, I want to be able to work at home some of the time, but there's value in me coming into the office, and there's value in me being able to collaborate face to face, even though we can collaborate, separately. I mean, I wrote 3 books with Wayne, and we never were together when we wrote any of them, right? So like it certainly can be done. My team has been virtual for years, so it certainly can be done. And yet we know that there are benefits to being in the same space. So then the next job of the leader is to make sure that when that's what we do, that we craft the work differently on those days. Like, you've heard the people who say, and there are people listening that have said this, like, why did I have to come to the office? I did exactly the same thing I did at home. To which I would say, then you shouldn't have had to come in. If the day isn't different when you're here, if there aren't more blocks of time when you're home where you're uninterrupted so you can get quality work done, and there's more time when you're in the office, when you are in meetings, you are collaborating, you are doing those things, that's when we're heading in the right direction. But if we're just saying we're going to be in 2 days a week because it's going to make it better, but we're not changing the way the days are when we're in or when we're out, what's the point?
The management has to create those different work environments. What are you doing when you're at home, and what does that day look like? What are you doing when you're here in the office, so that it's maximizing the value of their attendance in the office, which is great. But there is also, as you said, from a manager's perspective, managing people differently then when they're at home versus when they're in the office. And in the case of a hybrid work environment, now as a manager, we have to do both. And so can you maybe talk a little bit about that? What advice can we give somebody? So what is the difference in managing somebody remotely versus managing them in an office environment? And how do you kind of balance both when you do have a hybrid environment?
Well, the first thing I would say is everybody's hybrid is different, right? So some people's hybrid is some people come in, some don't, or people aren't always there on the same day. Like if you're a leader leading a hybrid team and you're only in certain days of the week and everybody in your organization is in certain days of the week, you've got to be really careful if you're not in on the same days as some of your team, because then what you have is proximity bias. Like the people that you do see on the days you happen to be in are at a disadvantage or an advantage, depending on how you look at it. And it might be both, right? Because that's who I see to put on a project. That's who so there's all sorts of things. So you've got to be very clear about proximity bias, like I'm going to grab you because you're here, Sam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to be careful about that kind of thing. I want to go back to something else though that you said earlier, which is it's the manager's job to help think this through about what we do when we're in the office and when we're not. To which I would say there's an awful lot of leaders say, man, that's hard. Like I don't know the answers to that. To which I would say everyone in your organization should help figure that out. So in other words, the leader's job should be to say, listen, we're going to be hybrid. So we're going to be in some of the time. So we together need to figure out what's going to be different when we're here and when we're not. What are the expectations about communication and the tools that we use when we're here and when we're not? What are our expectations about all of that? And so I don't have to have all the answers as the leader. I have to ask the questions and I need to engage in that, but I don't have to know all of it because none of us have done it before. So we should be figuring it out together. And it's one of the ways that we bring the team back together, much like at the start of the pandemic when we brought the team together, not physically, to figure out how to make it work. And we did figure out how to make it work. Right. So now it's like, why we don't have to put all the pressure on ourselves to have all those answers and bring the team together in that regard. That would be a huge piece of this. Now, back to finishing this, giving you a little more on this really big question of how do we lead differently in or out. The thing I would say is we have to be more intentional, because if I have to make sure that I'm interacting with my team members who aren't here in ways similar to the ways for those who I am seeing face to face. And so we have to think more about interaction with our team and not just transaction with our team, right? So when we were all separate, we were all apart, and it was all transactional, right? What do you need? How do you need it? Here's my question. Here's your answer. Boom, boom, boom. Thanks. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, Sam, that we as leaders have to make sure that we're interacting with our team members, that we're talking about more than just the work and the weather, that we're continuing to build our relationships with them, our credibility with them, our trust with them. And that's only going to happen if we're intentional about it, not just on the days we're in, but on the days that we or they are out as well. So one of the things that I've done for years is to say that one of the things on my list every single day is what I call the 5. And that means that every day I have the goal of having 5 interactions with members of our team, which is roughly a third of our team. Like, in other words, I need to make sure that I'm interacting with them and staying connected to them, not just talking about the work. Now, it may be because we're talking about work that we do a little more than that, but we have to stay connected. And as leaders, we have to take the lead in doing that. A lot of people who are listening, especially if you have a little more age like me, you know of a guy named Tom Peters, who is probably one of the people who was responsible for creating the market for business books, if you will. And Tom, in his book with Bob Waterman, wrote in Search of Excellence in 1982, that said we need to learn to manage by wandering around. And in one of my conversations that I had with Tom, which was pre-pandemic, but when we were starting to talk about all this stuff, he said, well, what do you do when your team is remote? Is it managing by frequent flyer miles? I said, no, Tom, it's leading by webcam.
Yeah.
In other words, we have to intentionally continue to stay connected with our folks, just like you would if they were down the hall. And that doesn't mean that I need to have depending on your work, that may mean I'm having a huddle with my team every day of 5 people or whatever. But what I'm really saying is, are you staying connected with them? And that means you have to be intentional about it. Because if you don't, days will go by and it won't happen.
Yeah, no, agreed. Well, that's kind of one of the reasons I like the hybrid work environment, which I think works at least for my organization. I know it's not right for everybody's, because even if you're together 2-3 days a week, you have that opportunity when you're in the office to do that. But you have to make an opportunity. You have to make the choice and the conscious decision not to stay in your office, but to get out there and wander around. Otherwise,
Exactly.
What's the difference, as you said before?
If your routine as the leader looks the same when you're home and then when in your office, then you're not taking advantage of the hybrid. Like, you've got to block the time to be doing that interaction, serendipitous conversation-y stuff that you wouldn't necessarily do when you were home.
There has been a group of employees that have been hired right out of university, right into a remote work environment. And they have spent a year or 2, and in some cases 3 years, working completely remote. And a recent study that I read just earlier this week showed that there is a skills gap between those people who have only ever worked remote compared to their predecessors who spent the first 3 years out of university working in an in-office environment. For all the things that we've talked about, the serendipitous conversations, the networking, the mentorship that they get, that you don't have the opportunity to get when you are behind a screen and have very limited focused online conversations, as opposed to kind of the general interactions and mentorship that happens naturally when you're in an office. Have you noticed that in the organizations that you work with? And if so, how do we overcome that to help this next generation get the training that they need to help the organization succeed?
Well, I would say that if you have hair the color of salmon eyes, which means that you've been around a while, which means that pre-pandemic, you knew what it was like to work in an office. Part of what you're saying, Sam, is these are people like, they don't know the before times. Like they don't have any context of what working in the office was. And so I think we're, number one, wise to realize that that may be a gap. But the other thing is, if you're my age, you're not probably the best person to help figure that out, because you did it that way so long that there's a whole bunch of stuff that you just know, that it's like profound knowledge. And so I think that's where you want to engage, back to your point, those folks that worked in the office 2-3 years before this, rather than those of us that have worked in the office 20 years before that. And so engage them more in, like, what is it that you are glad you had before we went away, right, that we need to give to others now? And so part of it's skills, Sam, to your point, but part of it is also, now back to us as leaders, is setting clear expectations. So we typically think about expectations as being the deliverables of the work, the what's of the work, right? The timelines and the deliverables and the quality and the quantity and all that stuff. And that's clearly important. And too many leaders, remote or otherwise, aren't very good at doing that anyway. But there's two other kinds of expectations that we need to really work on. And that's the why of the work and the how of the work. And it's the how of the work expectations that are the kind of things that play a role, a lot of what you and I have been talking about for this whole conversation, but also those skills or those practices that those newer employees need now, that they're going to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week because they've just never been there. It's not their fault. There's nothing wrong. It just means that they don't have that context. So we have to help them get that context, and we have to be clear about what our expectations are for them when they're in.
Yeah, agreed. Kevin, this is fascinating for me, and it's been very informative. It's reinforced some of the thoughts that I had, but it also reminds me, to your most recent point, that more and more I'm realizing that I am that, me and my business partner Don, who also has a lot of hair the same color that we do, that we're the two old white guys up in the Muppet, the Muppet Show, the two old white guys in the balcony. Those of us, again, old enough to remember that reference, just criticizing.
Google it, everybody. If you don't know what Sam's from, I just Google the Muppets. Old men in the Muppets.
Old white men in the Muppets. And that is unfortunately what we see, because it was a reality for us for so long that it was just commonly understood practice and best practice, and there was no challenging it. And sometimes I do feel, and I know this is something that I acknowledge in myself, I sometimes forget that I am not, despite all of my experience and despite the success that my business partner and I have had in building companies, what was successful then may not necessarily be successful today. And that's a hard pill to swallow and a hard habit to break when you're managing an organization.
The world of work and the way society views work has changed drastically in 3 years. And to what I said earlier, it doesn't mean that we have to throw out everything we know about leading, because an awful lot hasn't changed, right? Mm-hmm. Human behavior hasn't really changed. Group dynamics haven't really changed, but the context has changed drastically and at light speed. And for us to think that we can lead the way we always did in that situation is we would be sadly mistaken if we think that's what we can do. So we have to be thinking ahead. We have to be asking. We have to be learning. We have to be engaging with our teams. We need to be doing with our teams all the things that we want them to do with us. And if we do those things, we'll head in the right direction.
Yeah, excellent. And I think that's a great way to end this conversation, at least as part of it. A lot of education that's required by managers, and a lot of education still required by employees, and knowing maybe what they don't know and being open to what they don't know, as well as managers. And all this means is that we need to have another 20 of these conversations to kind of dig down. So I hope that I can count on you to
have me back. I'm ready to come back anytime, Sam.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. I think there's so many other things that we need to explore, and a little bit more about your book. Why don't you hold them up again? I'd like everybody to kind of get a sense of what they should be going and reading if they want more of these insights from you.
The Long Distance Leader, The Long Distance Teammate, and the most recently, The Long Distance Team. And you can
incredibly prophetic.
And you can find all of them at kevineikenberry.com/books.
All right. That makes it easy for everybody. I encourage you to go and do it, and stay tuned to 17th Floor. We'll definitely have Kevin back. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody watching.